The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today is the 17th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and every time that another year goes by, I am less and less sure about what should I be doing to recognize that anniversary. And sometimes we've done nothing in the 17 years since 9/11. Sometimes I will retell my 9/11 story of where was I. I was in junior year in high school in psychology class. A habitual troublemaker came in and said, "We're under attack." And our teacher, Mr. Palmisano, who sadly recently passed away, told this student, "I'm sure everything's fine. You've disrupted class enough today. Please sit down." And it's still in my mind as if it were yesterday. But today I'm going to do something a little bit different. It is the 17th anniversary of 9/11, and I'm going to point to an article that I read this morning on CNBC.com about the cost of the wars that we've engaged in since 2001. The United States has spent more than, and this is an extraordinarily conservative number, $1.3 trillion on the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria since 2001. And this is according to the Defense Department's own report. So first and foremost, this is an extraordinarily low estimate. 2.5 trillion is probably closer. There's actually a report from Brown University which says it's 5.6 trillion. That was from about a year ago, and the costs have not stopped since then. But more importantly, this is also only hard costs. It doesn't come close to accounting for the reality that if you took that 1.5 or 2.5 or 5.6 trillion and spend it in stimulative ways, the economic multiplier would have been worth way, way more money to the economy. What I mean by that is, imagine that you take the 1.5 trillion and you spend it on healthcare, for example. Healthier people, by virtue of being healthier and able to work, tend to earn more money than less healthy people. So the government collects payroll taxes, income taxes from those individuals. Healthier people in general are out and about spending more money at businesses than less healthy people. So if you take that war spending and you spend it on healthcare, you stimulate the economy. Take 1.5 trillion and spend it on education, for example. You take 1.5 trillion and spend it on education, more educated people make more money, meaning the government takes in more tax revenue. More educated people commit less crime, which saves on police. You get the idea. And just imagine for a second how much headway could have been made on climate change if you had spent 1.5 trillion or 2.5 trillion or 5.6 trillion. That is likely the more accurate number here. So when we look back at these 17 years and we look back at the spending of however many trillion, whichever, pick a number, whichever one you think is the more accurate one, what did we get for that 1.5 trillion? Iraq was a disaster. We removed an admittedly brutal dictator in Saddam Hussein, but one that was predictable and was interested in regional stability. We take him out. Iraq completely implodes. A vacuum is formed after more than 100,000, in all likelihood, civilian deaths take place. And a power vacuum leads to ISIS, which we now spend even more money fighting against. Afghanistan, you can argue that some progress has been made, however you define that, but what seemed like a kind of obvious to some people, not to everybody, this one makes sense 17 years ago, has increasingly become the same sort of bungled quagmire that we thought only Iraq was going to be at one point. We, some of us, not all of us. And then Syria is a total mess, militarily, geopolitically as well. That's my story this year on the 9/11 anniversary. And then, of course, when you tell that story, when you tell the story of the 1, 2, or 5, nearly 6 trillion spent on these wars since 9/11, you also have to tell the story of the global war on terror, a war which will never end. It won't end. It is now a sort of baseline. It's a starting point of how the United States spends its money every single year. It connects to warrantless wiretapping and NSA surveillance and so many of the civil liberties questions that have been raised. So I don't know that I can do too much different than anybody else in just replaying footage for you or thinking back to how horrible that day was. So what I'm doing differently this time is saying, think about in these 17 years, what has become part of the baseline that we now basically start from when we think about what are our priorities each year. What's the infrastructure that surrounds how we think about society? It's the global war on terror, it's defense spending, it's trillions on war, and continuing to fall behind other developed nations on healthcare, on privacy, and on so many other issues. And unless you vote to start making some changes in November, it's not going to change. And unfortunately, we talk about Democrats and Republicans being different on many issues and being effectively the same on many issues. This is one of those areas where too many of these centrist corporate Democrats that we're trying to replace, don't get me wrong, are not going to do a damn thing differently about. So think about this when you vote in what now is, 7 weeks until the midterms, which we'll be talking about more coming up later this week. The people of the United States, and really the people of the world, have been the targets of, or I think really I would say the victims of, a war on statistics, a war on reality from the Trump administration. I've talked for a very long time. This is one of my passion areas, right? How to lie with statistics. Number of people in the labor force. We've talked about labor force participation. When it's a Democrat, Republicans like to say record number of people not working. When it's a Republican, right now, under Donald Trump, you hear record number of people are working. And as I've explained to you before, when the population of the United States keeps growing, the raw number of people working or not working doesn't really tell us very much about the state of the economy as this isolated, out of context number. I've talked about gaslighting around unemployment numbers as well, which under Obama, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, were untrustworthy numbers that had been doctored that we simply can't trust. And now, under the Trump administration, those same numbers from the same agency are what we point to say, look at how great the economy is doing, if you were Trump or his cronies. But what I want to talk about today is not just unemployment numbers, but unemployment and GDP numbers, gross domestic product. I recently brought you the story of Donald Trump and his cronies going around claiming that GDP growth was at historic highs, much higher than ever during the Obama presidency, and it was simply untrue. They've now come up with a really great sounding lie that combines GDP and unemployment into a very neat little story that to a lot of people is impacting them, even though it's meaningless and it's a distortion. And that is, according to this tweet from Donald Trump, that the GDP growth rate is higher than the unemployment rate for the first time in more than 100 years. There are two levels of analysis to do here. First is the claim true? Second is, even if it's true, does it tell us anything important about the state of the economy? So let's start with part one. Is it true? No, it's not. I'm going to put up a graph for you here, which has two lines. The white line is GDP. The yellow line is unemployment. And as those who are watching along with me can see, the white GDP line has exceeded the yellow unemployment line many, many times. And this graph goes back only to about 1950. Now, according to Bloomberg, about 20% of the time over the last 100 years, the GDP has exceeded the unemployment rate. So question one is this an accurate statement about GDP and unemployment from Donald Trump? The answer is no. It's a total, bold-faced, provable lie. But I want to talk about the more important part, which is whether it's true or not, does it tell us anything? Does it tell us anything to compare an annualized quarterly GDP growth rate with unemployment numbers that are reported for the previous month? The answer is it tells us nothing. Okay, first and foremost, GDP, as I mentioned, is measured quarterly and unemployment numbers are monthly. So you have what's called a time horizon conflict in comparing these numbers. Just basic statistical ignorance taking place when you make that comparison. Secondly, Donald Trump said in his tweet that GDP growth was 4.2%. It wasn't 4.2% last quarter. It was 1.05%. But what Donald Trump is doing is taking that quarter of GDP growth and multiplying it by 4. Why multiply it by 4? Because that is the estimated yearly GDP growth rate if last quarter repeats 3 more times. That makes no sense when you are comparing that to monthly unemployment numbers. You're taking an annualized quarterly number and comparing it to a monthly unemployment number. And then lastly, there are reasons that unemployment can be up or down, which can be good or bad. You need to understand what's going on that's causing it. There are also ways, as I've told you before, that GDP can be up that aren't necessarily indicative of a great economy. For example, if businesses learn that big tariffs are coming, think about it. They will decide, or they might decide, to pre-purchase a bunch of raw materials before those tariffs hit. This can increase GDP now at the expense of GDP later. So bottom line, this is an untrue claim, but more importantly, it doesn't tell us anything material about how the economy is doing. But the problem is that the average Trumpist is so lost in space around economic indicators, trade, which has been a big topic of gaslighting by Donald Trump, all of the things Trump campaigned on, the idea that, listen, if it sounds good, it's going to work on the Trumpists, and that's all Trump wants, but it is total ignorance. It's not cognitive dissonance, it's ignorance. It's people who don't know or understand what they're talking about, following a guy who is equally ignorant about basic money and economic issues like this. Don't fall for this stuff because it will truly rot your brain. You can give me a follow on Twitter at @dpacman. You can also follow the show at David Pakman Show. We will take a quick break and be back after this.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is James Freeman. James, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. I also want to say thanks to today's longtime supporting member of the day, Jindrik Dusik, who's been with us since 2013. Great guy, longtime supporter of the show. James, Jindrik, thank you to both. You can join them at www.joinpakman.com. There is a coupon code available, vote soon 18, but actually a little later today, I will be talking about sort of a major new initiative and change relating to the David Pakman Show, and we'll have a conversation about membership there as well. The fallout from Bob Woodward's book about the Trump White House continues, and today I want to focus in on comments from Gary Cohn, who's a former economic advisor of Donald Trump's, who says, according to Bob Woodward's book, this is pretty full on, that Donald Trump has the IQ of an inbred tanning bed, which is really a nice comedic touch because just saying he has the IQ of a tanning bed is sort of funny, and it maybe is a connection to Donald Trump's fake tanning, which he is so known for. But adding the touch about the inbred tanning bed really puts it over the top for me. And this is now not merely anecdotal. That's really the story for me. The people who stop working for Donald Trump and don't have some personal interest in not disparaging him, sometimes their party, to non-disclosure agreements that they choose to abide by, although sometimes they choose to ignore them, or those who are not hired to be Trump apologists. So Corey Lewandowski, Trump's former campaign manager, sort of famously left Trump's world, organization, campaign, administration, whatever, and went on CNN, but he was hired as the Trump guy, so he wasn't going to go on and say bad things. Those who just leave and say what's on their minds seem to say really bad things about Donald Trump, including that the reality is way worse than what the public knows. And that's exactly what Gary Cohn, who was part of the Goldman Sachs wing of the Trump administration, is saying, according to Bob Woodward's new book. Cohn was the director of the National Economic Council for Trump for a little while, and he was reportedly stunned by how ignorant Trump was starting from day one. Trump has, according to Cohn, and from what we know, a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of basic economics and even of how money works. Remember that phone call he made to one of his national security advisors, Michael Flynn, to ask him about whether the dollar going up versus down was good for the United States. And Gary Cohn's anecdotes about Trump's money knowledge are truly amazing. Cohn told, according to Bob Woodward, Cohn told Trump that the Fed was probably going to be increasing interest rates during Donald Trump's first term. And Trump allegedly said, we should just go borrow a lot of money, hold the money, and then sell the money for more, and we will make money. And Cohn explained to him, no. If we borrow money, that increases the deficit, and you said you wanted to get rid of the deficit, to which Trump responded, just run the presses, print money, according to Bob Woodward. So the trend is Trump is ignorant. His first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, called him a moron. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, according to Bob Woodward, told close associates that Trump, quote, had the understanding of a fifth or sixth grader. Former White House Deputy Chief of Staff Katie Walsh reportedly said that working with Trump was, quote, like trying to figure out what a child wants. I don't even know that I agree, because you can usually figure out what the child wants. It doesn't seem to be clear what Trump wants. And Scott Pruitt, the EPA director, said in not so many words that Trump has effectively no understanding whatsoever of both the Constitution and the rule of law. Pruitt, one of the most corrupt and vile members of Trump's administration, even sees the absurdity of what he's dealing with Donald Trump. And now you have Gary Cohn saying that Trump has the IQ of an inbred tanning bed. There are two kind of parallel levels of debate or discussion taking place right now. On the right, within the right, you're starting to see some people engage in a debate with Trumpists about whether Trump truly is or isn't qualified to be president. That's actually kind of a win. Like, just the fact that we're seeing some Republicans say, okay, Hillary's a disaster, I hate Hillary, she's evil, she should be locked up, whatever, but Trump may not be qualified to be president, but I'm still a Republican and I want a Republican to be president. The left is beyond that. We're now mostly exploring on the left whether Trump is qualified to, I don't know, run a car wash. And I don't want to insult car wash owners. I think the answer is clearly no. Trump's not even qualified to run a car wash. And car wash owners likely are more qualified than Trump to be president. They probably have some basic understanding of how money works. Breaking Bad, I guess, would be one example of that. But this is alternate universes. We're seeing this fork, this divergence, where on the right, we're desperate to see even just a few introspective, critical comments about, listen, maybe this guy shouldn't be president, whereas on the left we're saying this is a crisis of monumental proportions. Next story is one of those stories about the headline versus the reality. What I mean by that is we often will come to you with a story where I will tell you, here's the headline of how it's being reported, and then here's the reality, or here's the sort of more important angle. Donald Trump and AIDS are reportedly, according to some headlines, on tape, laughing and joking about that horrible terrorist ambush that took place in Niger in 2007 that left 4 American service members dead. Now, you might remember our coverage of that incident. It happened in October of 2017, nearly a year ago. U.S. Special Forces were attacked, and 4 of them ended up losing their lives. There is a recording that has been made by former White House communications aide Omarosa Manigault-Newman. And the headlines would lead you to believe that Trump is straight up laughing and joking about the deaths of those 4 U.S. military service members. Now, I'm going to play it for you, and if you're like me, you will quickly realize that the news here is not Trump laughing about the deaths of service members, but it's something else. So let's take a listen to this clip.
We had 3.2 last quarter before this, so it's really going good. And we have a lot of things happening on the economic front. I think the military is doing good. And now on Niger. So what happens is we have decimated everybody. It's a rough business. They're rough too. They want to kill us. We've let the military do what they have to do. And what you call rules of engagement, or any way you want to say it, but we've let them do. And in the Middle East, there's very few left. We've done a very good job. We've done more in 7 months, because really it's 7 months that we started. We've done more in 7 months than they've done in 8 years. Okay, and so they're good there. But what happens is now they flee, and they flee to Africa, and they flee to Niger and countries around there. And that's how these young people get attacked, and they got attacked by 50 real fighters. But these were people, in many cases, that were in the Middle East that now go to Africa to try and, cause problems there. And ultimately, they want to come back here, because this is where they really want to be. So it's a rough business. I don't think I'd want to be a terrorist, right? It's not a good life, but it's the only thing that. What else is there? But that is, people don't say that. The reason they're there is because we forced them out, and there's not nearly as many. It's not nearly as intense, but it's pretty intense, and you see that happening. So that's that. I think Hillary's getting killed now with Russia.
So the real news here is not about Trump joking about dead service members. People in the room are laughing. Trump does appear to, like with most things, not understand sort of the seriousness of what's going on. But it's just not accurate to say Trump was laughing about the deaths or even laughing about the ambush. He was laughing about the idea that it's really bad to be a terrorist now because he's going after people so hard. The real revelations from this clip are, number one, even in the middle of all this stuff related to Niger, Trump still can't say Niger. That's notable because at that point he must have heard it, I don't know, hundreds of times from people that are around him. Number two, that he has no idea what he's talking about. I mean, this is a word salad reminiscent of Sarah Palin, who would experience these completely futile attempts to use language to communicate anything of meaning, Trump seemingly falling into sort of that same thing. And number three, even in private, Donald Trump was still transitioning from talking about this ambush in Niger to talking about Hillary colluding with Russia. That's the news here. It's not clear that Trump has any clue what the hell he's talking about. And as far as Trump telling jokes and his sense of humor, the guy has a real, one of the indications that someone may have sort of some serious either personality issues or mental illness or emotional issues is that their sense of humor seems very off in different ways. And this is not to stigmatize any condition or to cast aspersions. It's just sometimes you notice that somebody has something about them that is not functioning completely correctly based on their sense of humor and what they seem to laugh at or not laugh at. Trump's sense of humor has something fundamentally wrong with it. You might remember he was roasted on Comedy Central some time ago. And he seemed completely unable to sort of get what was going on and understand humor. You might remember years ago when President Obama was still president that Donald Trump was in the audience during a White House Correspondents' Dinner, and Obama told some, quite frankly, pretty funny jokes about Donald Trump, and Trump simply did not laugh, and it wasn't clear that he wasn't laughing because he was upset that he was the butt of jokes. It doesn't seem that he understands satire or humor, but for whatever reason, in this case, even though Trump's not laughing at dead soldiers, he found that the sort of circumstance where he would joke in general. And the disgusting thing is really his general handling of that ambush in Niger. We learned that while on the phone with one of the widows of one of the 4 deceased service members, Trump seemed to forget the name of the service member in question, and every element of Trump's involvement with that raid was despicable. The raid itself, its planning, the hugely questionable nature of the raid to begin with, Trump's reactions to the deaths, plural, totally deplorable. But this is not the right headline, I believe, and I think that there is a lot of interesting stuff in this recording from Omarosa. By the way, what other recordings does she have? That's really a growing, interesting question. But Trump is not laughing at dead service members, as was framed by some, but still a very interesting clip. Make sure you're following The David Pakman Show on Instagram at David Pakman Show. If you aren't, you are missing behind-the-scenes pictures from what goes on in the studio, from my recent trip, and also make sure you're following me on Instagram at david.pakman. Quick break, Andrew Seidel from the Freedom from Religion Foundation joins me next.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Today I'll be speaking with Andrew Seidel, who's a civil rights and constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where he serves as Director of Strategic Response. He works to keep church and state separate, as they should be. His first book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, will be out in May of 2019. Andrew, so great to talk to you. I've seen interviews that you've done, and I think that there's just so much material right now to discuss that you work on. So maybe just to start somewhere, when we talk about church and state separation, is this a concept that the average American has an accurate grasp on, or do you think that there are sort of some basics about what we mean by separation of church and state that maybe are missing from the layperson's understanding?
I definitely think there are some basics that are missing. And I would say not just from the layperson's understanding, but even from experts in this area of law. You know, we heard in Judge Kavanaugh's hearings this week how some people sometimes conflate the separation of state and church with hostility towards religion. And that's absolutely not the case. And in fact, you can't have true religious freedom, the freedom of religion, without a government that is free from religion. It's just the two cannot coexist. You have to have a secular government. It's a prerequisite for genuine religious liberty. And to me, that's the biggest thing that I think people don't understand about state-church separation, is that it protects every American.
And when you talk about that, that separation in terms of the infrastructure of law, there is the often discussed Establishment Clause idea of the concept of the government establishing one religion over others, or religion over non-religion, for example. But when you actually want to expand and take a deeper look at the law, what other relevant points of law are important when we think about what the foundation is for separation of church and state?
I mean, the foundation of state-church separation it's right there in the Constitution. You know, the Constitution mentions religion 3 times. Before it was amended, the only mention of it was in Article 6, which prohibits religious tests for public office. And I mean, this is actually really striking, especially for the founding generation. You know, at the time, no nation had ever divorced religion and government the way the founders chose to. In fact, our Constitution is entirely godless. It doesn't mention any supernatural being at all, which was also, this unique contribution of the founding generation. And then later on, a couple years later, they had the First Amendment, which says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And those are the only 3 mentions of religion in the entire document. And all of them are exclusionary, right? They're meant to keep religion out of government and government out of religion. So it begins and ends with the Constitution. And it's very clear if you look at that document, even just the words, you don't have to study it, you don't have to be an attorney, that the government has no, as Alexander Hamilton put it, no particle of spiritual jurisdiction, right? It just doesn't have the power to get involved in religion one way or another.
You'll sometimes hear from some people in the United States, we don't need to necessarily characterize who, that the Founding Fathers were religious, and thus you sort of have to read between the lines at this separation of church and state stuff, and that they fully intended that, okay, maybe some of these things are written into the law to prevent it from getting out of hand, but that really this is at core a, quote, Christian nation. Is that forget about the morality or the logic of it, right? Is that a legally valuable analysis, or is it as simple as what matters is what's written?
No, I mean, that's a completely flawed analysis. And actually, that's the subject of my book that comes out in May. I go through and debunk the entire idea of a Christian nation, or that we are even founded on Judeo-Christian principles. Both of these are flawed ideas. And you can argue about whether or not the founders were religious, whether or not they were Christian, whether or not they were evangelical Christian, Jesus rose from the dead kind of Christians, or even deists. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter, because we know that they wanted state and church separate, that they wanted these 2 different spheres of power, and they didn't want them intersecting or overlapping. And that's why Thomas Jefferson chose the metaphor of a wall, right? This isn't a fine line that is easily overstepped. It's a wall. It's meant to be tall and strong and impregnable. And it's meant to not just benefit all of our citizens, but even the religious citizens, right? I mean, the people who benefited most from the founding generation were religious minorities, and they were very supportive of state-church separation for that idea. Catholics and Southern Baptists were among the biggest supporters of state-church separation because they were minority religions, and they didn't want the government weighing in and coercing them or even pressuring them, however slightly, into one religion or another, or benefiting the majority religion, which is certainly something we're seeing happening today. Yeah,
what do you make of, I mean, we can talk about examples of 10 Commandments at a federal building. We can talk about manger displays and some of these other notable newsworthy cases, but at its core, isn't the fact that Christmas is a federal holiday an establishment of religion? I mean, I know that it's sort of like, it's almost too obvious, and it's not a battle that I think we're going to win anytime soon, but does that count as an establishment of religion by the government?
Sure, and as someone who is on the front lines of the war on Christmas every year, I would absolutely argue that it does. I mean, the way that courts have looked at this particular issue is they've said, well, because there is a valid reason for the government to want to close. In this case, it just happens that most people are Christian. They would want to take that day off anyway. The government would essentially shut down if 70% of the workers took the day off. That is, in their minds, in courts' minds, sometimes a secular purpose behind the holiday, so they've upheld it. However, the Freedom from Religion Foundation has actually gotten laws like that struck down when the purpose is very clearly religious. So here in Wisconsin, there was a Good Friday holiday, and I don't remember the exact reason that the legislature passed this law, but it was essentially something along the lines of, we want to make sure everybody can go to church and worship. And the government struck down that, or the court struck down that holiday when FFRF brought the lawsuit because it was overtly religious.
When we talk about the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, which held or affirmed that at the state level you cannot ban same-sex marriage, that was the end of one very important discussion, which was what is going to ultimately happen in terms of individual couples getting married. But it was very clearly only the beginning for a whole sort of new front in the battle against LGBT rights. And I've been talking about it since day one, which is arguing along lines of so-called religious freedom to discriminate in different ways against LGBT individuals, or people perceived to be LGBT individuals, who often are discriminated against in the same way. Talk a little bit about the relatively well-funded campaigns that now are operating, and whether it's about baking cakes or employer-employee relations related to religion and some of these other fronts. How would you generally characterize what's now being used as a way to fight against LGBT rights under the guise of so-called religious freedom?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack there. We could talk about that for hours. But basically what is happening is the religious right is attempting to redefine religious freedom. And actually, a better way to put it might be that they're attempting to weaponize religious freedom. You know, they're turning it into what used to be this shield to protect an individual's right to believe, and in some cases act on that belief in a way that wouldn't harm others, into now a way to impose their religion on other people. We're seeing it in the Hobby Lobby case from 2014, where this massive company is using religion to impose their religious beliefs on their employers. And as you pointed out, after the Obergefell decision that equalized marriage for LGBTQ individuals, you know, that push kind of kicked into overdrive. And what you're really seeing is the religious right trying to use God as a license to discriminate. And this is the big push that we are fighting back against here at the Freedom From Religion Foundation. We've been fighting against it since before the Hobby Lobby case. We saw this coming. We saw the attempt to redefine religious liberty coming, and we've been trying to push back against it. And finally, it does seem to be that the country is sort of waking up to this idea that, you know, just because you happen to have a belief and it happens to be religious doesn't mean you get to act on that belief. No, you know, they want to say, I can do this because my God says so, and it doesn't matter what the impact is on other people. But courts have never decided that, though this Supreme Court and the shifting Supreme Court, I would not put it past them. We've come dangerously close, and I think we're possibly on the verge of a seismic shift here.
One of the areas of concern to me about the shift from the conversation about can 2 men or 2 women get married at the state level to what we're talking about now, the use of so-called religious freedom to discriminate, is that one Supreme Court decision made it super clear: states can't ban same-sex marriage, period. That is it's very cut and dry in a sense, or at least relatively cut and dry. Religious freedom can be argued in so many different contexts and in so many different ways that it seems more complex to me to imagine that there can be any single decision at any level that would prevent that from being done, because you can argue it in so many different ways. Is that accurate, or could there be some umbrella solution here?
No, I think that's an excellent observation on your part. And actually, this has been addressed by the Supreme Court way back in the 1870s. They said that to allow a citizen to exempt themselves from the law because of their religion, that government could only exist in name under such circumstances, right? You would have, the law would become Swiss cheese, where anybody who believed in any particular belief, as long as it was religious, would be able to exempt themselves from whatever law they say burdens that religious belief. I mean, that is a recipe for anarchy, not for religious freedom. And honestly, they're doing a good job of pushing that narrative. I mean, you know, in the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, at its core, that case was about discrimination, right? I mean, it was a couple was discriminated against by a business, but the story that everybody talked about was the religious freedom of not a baker, but a bakery. And that is just amazing to me, how much they pushed this narrative and how far they've advanced it.
This is a good spot to pause with Andrew Seidel from the Freedom From Religion Foundation. We will pick up our conversation with him tomorrow, starting with, we'll get to the Trump administration, but we will start with the relationship between freedom from religion and freedom of speech, which is an increasingly popular topic, particularly in some online enclaves. We'll pick it up there. Andrew, thank you.
My pleasure.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
All right, so it's never really clear when the right time is to make announcements about show-related changes, but I think I'm going to do that today. Why not, right? So a little backstory. The David Pakman Show moved to Boston in November of 2015. We signed a 3-year lease at our studio, and that has been, to take a word from our current president's vocabulary, it has been a beleaguered experience with this 3-year lease at our current studio. We have had terrible internet, thanks at least in part to the internet service provider monopoly industrial complex that most parts of the United States experience. We had almost 3 full years of construction happening around us and constant negotiations and arguments and disagreements and tension with the landlords that manage the building, not to mention the sort of daily clomping, as we have come to refer to it, taking place above us at the studio. So we are not exactly in what we would call a good studio situation. And even with all of that stuff aside, we're not in what one would call like a modern building or one that's technologically advanced. It's not just that the internet infrastructure in our building is bad. The electrical system is outdated. Even the sort of basic construction is outdated. Massive sound transfer, not just from the noise above us, but side to side, from outside the building, from below. So long story short, and many of our members know this because we talk about it on the bonus show, it's been a nightmare at our current studio. We've also been working kind of at the same time on upgrading the production quality of the David Pakman Show when it comes to image and audio quality. And the benefits of those upgrades would sort of be irrelevant unless we can solve the noise around us issue and solve the internet bandwidth issues that we're dealing with. So the big announcement is that the David Pakman Show is indeed going to be leaving current David Pakman Show headquarters. Now, once we leave, it won't be David Pakman Show headquarters anymore, but that's sort of like a semantic discussion, which we can have some other time. I want to stick to the important things during this segment. So we are indeed going to be leaving the current studio and leaving that part of Boston at the end of our lease, or maybe within the last month of that. Where are we going to go? We are going to go to Calgary, Alberta. No, I'm kidding. We're staying in Boston. The David Pakman Show is not changing location in terms of city or state, but we are going to be going to a truly state-of-the-art facility, a building that has been completely gutted and renovated to be a place for technology companies and endeavors. It's been built that way from the ground up. We are going to have, I am extraordinarily pleased to say, people who get the bonus show already know how much pleasure I take in telling you that we are going to have what is within reason the fastest internet available in Boston. And I say within reason because if we were willing to pay $1,000 or $2,000 a month for a dedicated fiber connection plus the installation of the infrastructure, we could probably get faster internet. But putting that aside, we are going to have, colloquially speaking, generally speaking, the fastest internet available in the city. We are going to have a properly soundproofed and sound insulated studio with the most modern power infrastructure that is available. And as usually is the case with these transitions, there's going to be an interim period that might be sort of like a step back before we go several steps forward. But the long term is going to be very good for the show. So what I'm announcing today is a $100,000 Indiegogo campaign. I'm kidding. We're not doing that. We've actually gone about this a different way this time. We have decided to partner with two, in fact, strategic, longtime supporters of the show with the idea that if we build it, support will follow. If the program improves and becomes more professional and better, that support is going to follow. So in the last few months, as some of you may know, you might have thought that when I said we're scrapping a bunch of advertisers and we're extending the show 10% every single day, that it was just for kicks. That's not the case. That was part of this broader upgrade an expansion of the David Pakman Show. So we've fronted the costs of the studio transition, including build out, but also security deposits and prepaid rent, all of that stuff. And what I'm asking of you is that if you want to support us in this expansion and transition, if you value what we do and want to help us do it better and in a more professional way, we've partnered with two very generous longtime supporters who are willing to donate $30 every time that a new person gets a yearly membership at half price for $30. So in total, each of these supporters is willing to do 100 of these. So 200 people in total can get a membership. Instead of paying $60, you pay $30, but these two generous longtime supporters are going to send us an additional $30. This is like 10 cents per hour-long daily episode, if you want to slice it up that way. $30 for the year, and you can keep that discounted price for as long as you want, and we get an additional $30 for every person that signs up using a particular coupon code. How do you do it? You just have to email me, okay? Email me. You can either go to davidpakman.com and click on the contact form. This is so important. What we're doing is just so important. I'm personally handling these requests for these discounted memberships. So you can go to our website or you can email me directly, david@davidpakman.com. Either way, I will be your personal membership concierge. That's how important this is, and say, hey, David, I want one of those half-priced memberships. $30. If you get one of those fancy lattes per month, you're spending more in a year on those than what a full year of membership will cost you. Membership continues to be the #1 funding source for our program, and instead of doing a fundraising campaign in advance and saying, here's the things we want to do, we've done it, okay? During October, the transition is going to happen. The money's been spent, the deposits have been done, rent has been prepaid, equipment and all sorts of different things have been purchased. And what now I'm asking you to do is to say, hey, you know what? This David Pakman Show thing, it's here and it's going to improve and it's going to grow. I'm going to do my part, 10 cents an episode. Get in touch, david@davidpakman.com. I will get you that coupon code to get the half-price membership. If the show is as valuable to you as one latte per month for a year is, please consider getting in touch and getting that code. And I look forward to hopefully telling you about the success of this campaign. Let's talk about paddling students on the butt. Kind of a weird topic for a political show, but it's what a school in Georgia wants to do. A school in Georgia has sent out consent forms to parents asking for permission to reinstate the paddling of students on the rear end as punishment. There are many people who are outraged, but there are also parents in the district who are pleased. 1/3 of the parents at this school reportedly signing the consent form. So to understand this story, you have to understand the term strict father morality. This is something I've talked about on the program many times. This is something that exists among the right, which exposes that even though they care to claim about policy, they don't really care about the best possible policy. They care about what feels fair to them or what feels like justice to them. And for them, justice usually means consequences that feel good. There's this phrase that's become popularized. I guess it's been popularized by Ben Shapiro, although I'm not totally sure. Facts don't care about your feelings. It turns out that for the right, their approach is our feelings are more important than the facts. So let me give you an example of that, and then I'll tell you how it applies to the paddling of students in Georgia schools. The right claims to be against abortion and to want to reduce the number of abortions, they say, to zero. That's great. There's actually a lot of people on the left and the right that would agree on that. Let's reduce the number of abortions to zero or as close to zero as possible. It happens that we know how to do it. Comprehensive sex education and no-cost access to contraceptives. The right is against that. The right wants abortion bans, no sex ed, and no access to contraceptives. Why? Because a so-called strict father would say, if you have non-procreative sex, then you deserve to get pregnant. And if you do get pregnant, you deserve to carry the baby to term and then to raise it. When it comes to crime, another example, we know that stricter punishments don't deter crime. The threat of a stricter punishment doesn't deter serious crime. And I recently did a lot of reading about this, and it turns out that the threat of the death penalty for a particular crime compared to the threat of life in prison doesn't deter crime. Harsher prison sentences versus lighter prison sentences don't reduce recidivism rates, but the right claims that they do, and they want those harsher sentences because it feels morally right and morally just. The people who committed the crime deserve the punishments. And along the same lines, we know that physically punishing children is not a good thing in the long term, but there are parents who continue to physically punish their kids. And there is now a school in Hefzibah, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, Georgia, sent home consent forms telling parents that if they want, they can sign off on the new policy of using paddles to punish students. Paddling means spanking a kid on the butt with a wooden board. And according to the superintendent, a third of parents agreed to have the school paddle their kids as necessary. They explained how it will work, which is that the student will be taken into an office behind closed doors. The students will place their hands on their knees or a piece of furniture and will be struck on the buttocks with a paddle only after the third offense. This is a choice. It's not just strict father morality. This is a choice for what's easy over what works. You paddle a kid, it really seems like you're doing something, and then you send them back to class. They might be embarrassed, maybe they'll behave a little better in the short term, but the reality is that the behavior issues are often coming because of what's going on in the home, or upbringing, or family situations, or other factors. Paddling a kid doesn't deal with the underlying issues. Some parts of this country have figured that out. Other parts of this country are still in the dark ages, and that is truly horrifying and scary. And I don't know if I should be pleased that 2/3 of the parents in Hefzibah, Georgia, didn't sign the paddling consent form, or horrified that 1/3 did. I lean towards being horrified that 1/3 did. We have a voicemail number. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. You can call any time of day. I got a call now that the NFL season is starting back up about the protests by NFL players who kneel during the national anthem. Here is what that voicemail said.
Hello, David Packman. Big fan of your show. I just thought of something rather fascinating. So all these NFL players that are kneeling, I would like to know what your thoughts would be if they were kneeling to end the military-industrial complex. If, let's say, the NFL players decided to not only kneel for police brutality being minimalized or...
Yeah. So the important thing here is I don't care why they're kneeling. Right? That's the thing. Whether I agree with why they are kneeling or not, it doesn't change the underlying reality of what's going on, which is that it is a form of speech, and I support that. It's not violent. It is calling attention to an issue that is important to them. It doesn't matter what I think about it. Now, I think it would be great to have more proactive protests of the military-industrial complex, but my opinion doesn't matter. My opinion doesn't matter. And it is a distraction, not in the sense that it's not a relevant issue, but it's a distraction to focus on the reason they are protesting. They have the right to do it. They should not be punished, period. We have hopefully a great bonus show coming up for you today. We will hear about Pat's vacation. I will tell you about the continued tech troubles going on here in Paris, France, and much more. Don't miss today's bonus show. Sign up at www.joinpacman.com. Coupon code available if you want it. Vote soon 18. I will speak to you then.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.